From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. Raffles Institution celebrates its 200th anniversary in 2023. The school is more than an institution, weaving itself into Singapore's history through the decades. Nowhere is this documented better than in the Rafflesian, which has been the official school magazine since 1886, and many other student publications. Today, we speak to Theophilus Kwek and Lara about 135 years of student writing they have helped curate in the new anthology titled Some Dreams from Now. Thanks very much, Theo and Lara, for joining us today. To start off, Theo, how did the idea for this book come up in the first place?
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for having us on this podcast. The book actually has been in the works for a couple of years. And right at the start of that process, about 2 years ago in 2021, Mrs. Yap of the Raffles Archives and Museum shared with me and some of the other old boys from Raffles, as we sort of refer to ourselves, that the team at the school had done a lot of work to digitize some of the archives that were held by the school. These included many student publications dating all the way back to the very first issue of the Rafflesian, which is the school magazine, and all the way through the years to the present day. That very first issue of the Rafflesian was in 1886. And so putting that together with other sorts of student publications to the year 2021, that gave us 135 years of student writing to look at. This, to me, was actually one of the largest continual records of student published writing, at least in the English language that we have in Singapore. So I thought it was very important that we go through the record and pick out pieces of writing that present a sort of different view of Singapore history than we might expect. This will be useful for students. It will give them a different sense from sort of a textbook view of history, but it will also be useful to the wider Singaporean readership to have a sense of how young people saw this island and this city developing through time. So together with some others, and eagerly supported by folks like Dr. Aaron Maniam, who is on the school's board of governance, we put together a team and we decided that we would, for the school's 200th anniversary in 2023, put together an anthology of student writing from throughout the years from Raffles Institution, not to be the history of Raffles Institution or the history of Singapore, but just to present a slice, a view of history, a perspective of history that we might not encounter so often.
Could you describe the curation process with the student volunteers in shaping the book's content?
Certainly. To me, this book's process was an opportunity to get current and recent students involved in the process of putting a book together. Now, I thought back to my own time as a student, and it was always fun to be involved in stuff outside of the A-level syllabus, especially with that looming over our heads. And I thought that actually the process of putting this book together would be a great opportunity to bring students up to speed in the sort of historical and literary knowledge that it would take to put together an anthology of this nature. There were some hard skills involved, archival research, the selection and curation of pieces, but there were also lots of soft skills that were involved in the process, I think, and a chance to hone some of those, whether through thinking through our ideas of history together, finding consensus around very different literary styles of writing or different historical interpretations. And Lara, who's on the call, will be able to tell us more about that later. But we had a team of really intrepid students coming together from different year groups, Sec 4 to JC2 or Year 6. And there were boys and girls. There were students from arts classes and science classes. There were also students who brought with them many different life experiences. We had students who were, of course, lovers of the humanities, our history and lit students, but we also had students who did some really quirky and fun things outside of the classroom, as I found out when I was putting together all of their applications to join this team. So we had a really strong team. We met several times at the start of the process. I did a sort of very participatory workshop session where we would go through a few sample pieces together and get a sense of how we describe pieces of writing to each other, how we arrive at agreements over different styles and different decisions, and even how we think about telling a narrative or a historical story to someone else. And then after this workshop process, the students went through the archives, and this was the heroic part of the effort. They went through all 135 years of writing, and they came up with more than 300 pieces from the archives as a short list. From that point, then there were 3 different teams of students focusing on different parts of the archives. So I was in touch with the 3 teams separately, and we narrowed down that short list to the book that you have today. So this process, I think working with the students itself, took about a year of the process. And then after that, there was another half a year of working with the publishing team and the school team to sequence the book, to put together the front and back matter so that we had the right context for interpreting this work. And I think it was really a team effort, and books like these take a village to bring into the world.
So, Theo, what were some key themes from the archival pieces that particularly stood out for you?
I think that because this book spans such a long period of time, 135 years, inevitably, the perspectives in this book went through a huge sea change. We have to bear in mind that when the first issue of the Rafflesian was published, that was shortly after the Anglo-Burman War, which was what the editors of the Rafflesian at the time described as the quote-unquote little war in Burma. But that actually brought the British Empire to its peak, to the fullest extent of its worldwide reach. And being students in a colonial institution at that point in time, there were things about this expansionism that appealed to them. But it was also interesting to hear very local perspectives, sort of telling a different story of empire, thinking about how this would affect them here in Singapore, far away from the action, thinking about what it would then mean for cities like Singapore and Hong Kong as outposts of empire and their relationship with the government in London. Now, moving on from there, some themes that came to the fore in the early 1900s were a growing sense of what it meant to belong to Singapore. Now, we don't have the sort of full-fledged nationalist movements yet in this pre-war period, but I think in quite early pieces from the 1920s, 1930s, we already have students referring to themselves as quote-unquote Singaporean. And that's not a word that I think most of us expect to find till much later, but we do see it in the archives. Students referring to themselves as the word Singaporean, at the time denoting living in Singapore, being from Singapore. Of course, many of them would still have families arriving from overseas or who had more recently moved to Singapore. It was very much a migrant society, but already there was this nascent sense of identity that was growing. And then we move into the World War II period, and I think what stood out around this period were initially, of course, the anxieties about the disruption to life, but in the immediate post-war period, a very stark sense of what it meant to survive. There were these boys whose education had been disrupted by the war, coming back to school and telling these harrowing stories about their experiences during the Japanese occupation. Of course, during this time, it wasn't just boys. Of course, at the school, there were also girls at the school. And they, in the post-war period, gave their own take about the tumultuous events that were happening at the time, the Malayan emergency, the rise of trade unions, and the shift towards independence. In the post-independence period, I think those concerns are much more familiar to us now. In the post-independence period, we hear students expressing their anxieties about capitalism, about the rise of consumerism. There are so many poems about shopping malls, about the loss of tradition, about festivals that are fading away. And some of these concerns are still very live with us today, right? We are still concerned about some of these things, the loss of a sense of cultural identity, the loss of a sense of kampong spirit. These are still ideas that resonate in society today. So I think in the post-independent period, a lot of these themes and concerns are still familiar to us. I think the biggest takeaway from all of this is the sheer breadth of different experiences and perspectives that students went through. We sort of have a quite narrow idea sometimes, I think, of the Raffles Institution students. I am very glad that this book brings together many different kinds of student perspectives from throughout time. that sort of unsettles our idea of what it meant to go to a school like Raffles Institution.
At this point, is there any particular piece that you wish to highlight and discuss?
Yes, thanks, Dev. One of the poems that really comes to mind, I'll just read a short one. It's a poem from 1962. And bear in mind, this is at the heat of the Cold War. It's very close to Kennedy's assassination. And there are the fears of an arms race that are looming over the world at this point in time. And there's a poem written by a student, Look Yap Kwen, and it's called After the Pyrotechnic Display. And it's a sort of post-apocalyptic poem that tells about his anxieties towards nuclear destruction, the uses of weapons of mass destruction at this point in history. And I'm just going to read the poem. It's very short, just 4 lines. After the pyrotechnic display. The ash-filled dawn led in another new day, with what remained from the night's display. Gone were democracy, Rids, Elvises, or the stork. And by the way, burnt human flesh smells like roast pork. It's a very politically incorrect poem. It's funny in its own way, but I think it expressed that sort of sense that with the dreaded power of nuclear destruction, all of humanity's petty squabbles, whether they were political, whether they were cultural fears at the time, would be irrelevant. And there was this very real sense of a younger generation that was born into a world on the brink and trying to express the discomfort that they felt, holding their elders to account to say, how have you allowed the world to get to this point? How have you allowed these weapons to be developed? That really all our quarrels about democracy or about cultural influences really mean nothing in the snap of a finger. And I think that our youth today would also resonate with this sense. Today, many of our students have an acute sense of being born into a world that's facing climate emergency. And there's once again, the very real sense of standing on the brink of history and trying to hold their elders to account. So I think this very short poem from 1962 really does speak to us here in 2022. Well, 23.
So, Lara, when sifting through the archival publications, how similar or different do you think their perspectives or concerns were compared to students of today?
Okay, so before I kind of delve into the meat of my answer, I'll just give a disclaimer that obviously I was not part of every single team in the process of collating this anthology. So I was actually part of this focus group which dealt a little bit more with prominent past Rafflesians. So we only really looked at kind of a select group of works from a couple of people. So I'm not sure if I can give the most accurate holistic representation of all the works that we chose, but just to answer the question, I think that there are definitely similar perspectives compared to students of today. There are definitely universal concerns like youth, like what Theo said, that feeling of being on the brink and, having a lot of anxieties about the future. And you also see a lot of works reflecting on the transience of JC life, I guess. And also lots of things about pondering the loss of cultural heritage and wondering what it means to be a Singaporean. I guess there's a very common mindset that people in whatever younger generation in history might have is that people from the older generations don't understand what it's like. They don't understand the concerns of, like, let's say, young people today. But I think working on this project, it definitely challenged that assumption that I think a lot of people might have, because I think it is true to a large extent that, people from the older generation they did experience youth as well at some point in their lives. And I think, therefore, you can see that a lot of the concerns are actually similar, and there's a common thread or common themes running throughout different poems. But I will say that I think students back then also had different perspectives, especially with the way that they approach creative writing or reflection or reflecting on their school lives. I think just from my own observations, I think a lot of young people right now are slightly desensitized to creativity because, I mean, understandably, the world right now is pretty chaotic, and I think a lot of our energy is focused outwards and, towards things like social media, interacting with other people online. So I think the students of RI back then probably had a lot more time and just mental space for introspection, which I guess is one thing that I see coming up a lot in some of the old publications. So I think that quality of introspection and just letting your creative juices flow, I think that is something that really stood out to me, because you see students reflecting on things that we would take for granted, that some of us might take for granted right now, like what is the value of our education? What is, the purpose of certain school rituals or certain parts of school culture? So I think back then students also carried a different perspective towards school, in the sense that they were probably a lot more sensitive to what was going on around them, especially because school was probably, it formed, for lack of a better word, like the majority part of their life. It was probably one of their biggest concerns. Whereas I think now our lives are kind of a little bit all over the place, because like as youth, our existences are kind of spread across a lot of different platforms, a lot of different areas.
So, Lara, how did participating in this project influence your perspective and understanding about RI's institutional history and impact?
I think participating in this project definitely, it kind of reaffirmed what I had always thought about RI going into the school, that it definitely has a very long and rich history, and whether consciously or unconsciously, I think it fosters a certain type of reflection, a certain kind of introspection and reflection in its students. I think obviously things are not the same anymore, and especially since a lot of, we don't have a lot of the same old publications that previous generations of Rafflesians used to get involved in, like the Rafflesian Times. I believe it is pretty much defunct now. And I think, so in a certain sense, you don't see this, we no longer really see this very open outpouring of creativity or enthusiasm on being published on such a wide platform. But I think that, I'm sure that students, express their creativity in other ways. It's just a little bit more decentralized, but I think regardless, RI is a place that is, I think, has always been built on self-expression and having that spirit of curiosity and questioning what is going on around you, especially as a young person. So definitely participating in this project kind of, it is cheesy, but I guess it did make me quite proud to be a Rafflesian, to know that we have such a illustrious history of not just in terms of achievements, but in terms of, students who just reflect very deeply on their place in the school narrative and making it and constructing that narrative at the same time.
By the way, do you have any favorite piece from this anthology that you want to talk about?
Okay, the first poem that kind of comes to mind it's called Pulau Ubin by Judith Huang. And I guess in terms of like RI generation, she's a little bit closer to me than 1962. So for better or for worse, I think this poem and her poetry in general has resonated with me, because I think the concerns that she and other poets in their generation explore are themes that I see coming up in my own education and my own discussions with the teachers and students around me. So okay, I'll just read the poem. It's not that, it's just about a page, but it's the sentences are quite short. So I'll start reading it now. Pulau Ubin. It cannot be denied that the fields and forests have their minds. After all, morning dew does mix with earth, and there are fields of rain. And the hens and cockerels, they have to defecate somewhere. It is also true that such simple happiness here is often found in thatched houses that burn easily, down algae-choked wells, and could well be boxed up and kept in cement villages, complete with running water. Besides, the sands you step on are blackened with industrial oil and ugly mangrove. The shards of glass make them dangerous. They chip wounds away, meld blood too close. Imported sand would do better. It is silken, white, the way this sand could never be. Yes, all this is true. Besides, these sampans are small, and the salt sea stings its passengers too freely. Today, Pulau Ubin will be given a facelift. They will mold her into something prettier, remove the mud from her sand. Today, I return to the mainland, leaving 2 small mounds of sand on the concrete pavement.
What would you say is the thing that made it your favorite piece?
I think the themes explored here are quite relevant to everything that Singapore is experiencing today. I mean, the constant kind of conflict between tradition and modernity, and now I think that there's even an environmental element coming in, especially since climate change is now the new hot topic. So I think that it's definitely familiar ground in terms of themes and issues explored that make me relate a little bit more easier to it. But at the same time, I guess I do feel like I have a personal connection to it because my family is from Malaysia, Penang specifically, and I think I've written a couple of poems myself that do deal with this sense of loss or this kind of cynicism towards modernity and kind of making everything too shiny too fast. Because we all know what happened to the beautiful shoreline of Georgetown, Penang. And yeah, which is why I think whenever these kinds of issues and conflicts are explored, it just kind of hits me in the right spot.
So, Theo, how does this book fit into the broader understanding of Singapore's history, which tends to be dominated by political and economic narratives?
I think what this book gives us is a sense of possibility. I think, as you have rightly pointed out, lots of our history is structured in a certain way. It's structured in a way that privileges, the development of the nation state, privileges the development of the market economy that we know today, as well as a lot of the sort of policies and constructs that undergird our livelihoods and our social support and our housing and our infrastructure today. But all of that aside, right, here we have the clear, consistent thread through 135 years of the voices of students, for whom before entering the professional world, before arriving at university even, they may have spoken or written without a sense of all of these overarching structures and narratives. But it did not mean that they were naive to them. They translated in their own words what nation building meant to 15 and 16-year-olds, how it would shape daily lives, how it would shape their relationships with their elders and their juniors, how it would shape the future that they were growing up into. And the possibilities that they expressed were both positive and hopeful ones, but there were also negative and anxious ones. And I think it brings us all back to that point in our lives where perhaps as young people or as students, we are looking out into a future that we don't know very much about yet. And we are expressing our best hopes for it. But we are also expressing the sense that we need to know more. We need to find out more. We need to learn more. And we need to have more knowledge and more skills at our disposal before we can do something about it. So I think it's sort of that feeling of being on the brink or on the edge that this book captures for us. I hope to bring across the sense of that in the title, which is Some Dreams from Now. The title, we haven't mentioned it yet in this chat, but it's taken from a poem by Chandran Nair, who is, of course, a very prominent Singapore poet. And it's from a poem that he wrote while he was in school. And it sort of pays homage to the last couple of lines of this poem, which is called At the Old School. And the last few lines of this poem, which I'll just read out, go, "And idly he wonders how you will remember this, some years, some dreams, a home, a wife from now. And this quote from Chandran Nayar's poem captures that in-between sense of a young person about to enter the world and already knowing that he will look back on his youth with a very different sense of the past. And I think that really sums up for me that in-betweenness of youth, that unique perspective of the world that students were able to bring, and which form that one consistent thread that ties this whole book together.